Welcome to the Church of St Gregory the Great, Kirknewton, Northumberland. There's been a church on this site since the 11th century. Although it's changed in many ways since that time, some of the foundations still remain. The area we're in at the moment is the nave, and that was built in Victorian times, and it was designed by the Newcastle architect John Dobson. The north aisle and the porch were both completed in 1860 at a cost of some £1,000. At that time, the bell turret was quite small, and it was redesigned and rebuilt to the current bell tower at a cost of some £500, and that was completed in 1880. Now, if we go down to the chancel, we'll see some of the older parts of the church. The chancel is a barrel-vaulted part of the building. Constructed in the mid-15th century, it was really built as a fortress because Kirknewton was in the centre of the Border Reivers uprisings. The chancel was much longer when it was built, but in the times of its Victorian restoration, it was made shorter. It's built on very thick foundations, as can be seen from the south window, and this was done as a fortification. In fact, the Bishop of Durham gave the incumbent permission in the mid-15th century to hold Mass in any safe location away from the church. The vaulting reminds me of an upturned hull of a vessel, and it's a very dramatic piece of building, although it's very austere, but is offset by the very attractive stained glass windows behind me, which date from 1902. Now we're in the burial chapel, which again is an older part of the church. It has the same barrel-vaulted ceiling as the chancel. It's named after an important local family, the Burrells. We have a tombstone here of Andreas Burrell and his wife. You can see there has been inlays at some period, probably in brass, to depict the faces and the hands of the couple. The chapel itself is still in use today and is sometimes used to take services. This stone carving is a treasure of the church. It depicts the Magi approaching the baby Jesus with the gifts. It's unusual in as much as the carvings would show the Magi wearing kilts. Also, the hats are quite unusual and are similar to those shown in the Roman catacombs, which may indicate that it goes back to the time of St. Paulinus, himself a Roman, which would predate the carving to the church by several hundred years, which would make one think, where was it prior to coming into the church? We're now looking at another depiction of the nativity scene. On this occasion, it's a wooden carving. It formed the reredos at the Mindrum Chapel before it was deconsecrated. When the chapel was deconsecrated, the carving came to us and has hung into the church ever since. We don't know who it was made by, but obviously a very skilled craftsman, and it certainly adds to our celebrations during the Christmas Nativity. Behind me are two stained glass windows which were raised by the personnel of RAF Millfield, which was an operational station during the Second World War. It was raised to remember those who lost their lives flying out of Millfield and included many Commonwealth airmen. Their war graves are in the churchyard and are well maintained by the War Graves Commission. We also have a roll of honour for those who lost their lives in the First and Second World Wars from local people, and that's depicted behind me. Even today, we get families who visit the war graves from various parts of the world, and even recently in our visitors book we have comments from a family from New Zealand who visited one of those graves. We have many commemorative plaques in the church, but the one behind me specifically relates to a very important family in agriculture who lived in the area. This one relates to Matthew Cully. He and his brother George Cully and James Cully were born in the Darlington area and were members of a very large family. But they came to this area to live and work in later life. George and Matthew particularly were very keen innovators in agriculture, and they in fact developed the 5-year rotation of crops. This meant that land never lay fallow but was never overworked. However, their great claim to fame was in the breeding of sheep. Animal husbandry was their speciality. In their time, sheep were more like deer, long-legged and quite slim, but they wanted to develop a meaty animal for the mass market. And in doing so, they crossbred various breeds until eventually they developed the Border Leicester, which today is a very popular breed still and gives excellent meat for the market. The window behind me was erected in memory of the Honourable Captain Claude Lambton, who lived at West Newton House, and it commemorates his love of the countryside. It's based on Psalm 104. He sendeth the springs into the valleys, which run among the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field, and wild asses quench their thirst. By them shall the fowls of heaven have their habitation, which sing among the branches. He causes the grass to grow for the cattle, and herbs for the service of man, that he may bring forth food out of the earth. The high hills are a refuge for the wild goats, and the rocks for the conies. The man goeth forth unto his work, and to his labour until the evening. O Lord, how manifold are thy works! In wisdom hast thou made them all. The earth is full of thy riches. This is the font for the church, and it's dated 1663. We believe it's been in the church since that time, so it's seen many, many baptisms. And I'm delighted to say that I had the joy of seeing my granddaughter baptised here, and more recently my grandson. Someone else who was baptised here was Josephine Butler in 1828, the year of her birth. She was born at Millfield House to the Gray family, who are well known for their liberal political beliefs. She went on in Victorian England to become a great reformer, working with underprivileged women. She worked hard to have the Contagious Diseases Act repealed, and she was successful in that. She was also a great advocate of women's education. After the death of her husband, she returned to the area to live, and she eventually died herself in 1906. Josephine Butler's grave is also situated in the graveyard of this church. On the centenary of her death, in 2006, a window was commissioned and has been put into the porch. It shows lilies growing from a stem of metal. The binding and the metalwork depicts depression, and when it grows into the lilies, it's faith in the resurrection. Behind me is the Davidson family grave. The Davidsons were a well-known family in the area, and Alexander Davidson was a ship's chandler. He serviced Admiral Lord Nelson's ships during the Battle of the Nile and Copenhagen, and there's a monument erected to Alexander Davidson on the hill behind the church in his memory. Here we have the graves of Claude Lambton and his daughter, people we've already heard about it in the church. This grave relates to one of Claude's cousins, Professor Anne Lambton. Anne was an emeritus professor at London University and lectured in Persian history. During the Second World War, she held the role of press attaché in Tehran, a role unheard of for a woman in those days. She was a devout Christian and she advised archbishops on matters of faith. When she retired, she returned to Kirknewton because of her love of the countryside, and she took a great interest in St. Gregory's Church as well as many other local churches. Another grave that I have a particular interest in as a retired police officer is that of P.C. Scott, who died in the line of duty. His grave is on the north side of the church. Thomas Henry Scott was a police officer at Paston. One night in the late 19th century, he went out in search of poachers to Shotton Farm, which borders with Scotland. He saw two men, one of whom was Stovey Jock Tate from Yetham, and pursued them. He was hit on the head with a large stone, or clemmy, and sustained injuries. 2 weeks later, he died from those injuries, having contracted tetanus. The men were arrested and taken to Wooler Police Station, where they were detained, and the case was heard at the Magistrates' Court. They were actually convicted of manslaughter and not murder. The reason being that the officer, when he crossed the wall to detain them, had gone into Scotland, and he had no jurisdiction there. The gate is still in existence, and to this day is still known as the Policeman's Gate. When he was dying, the officer wrote a letter, and in it he said, "I fell doing my duty. I fell fighting hard."